Imagine you are 18. Your hair is braided and oiled at dawn. Saffron stains the hem of your veil. The street is a corridor of torches and chanting voices, neighbors, clients of your father's household, other households that come to see and to mark the transfer of a woman from one family to another. They hum the old songs that promise protection and fertility. They laugh in the way that insists you understand your place. You cross the threshold of a house that, to everyone outside, is simply the home of your new husband. To the household itself, however, it is also a courtroom, a registry office, a locus where law becomes flesh. By the time the door closes behind you, the celebration has already begun to reveal its other face, something procedural, exacting, and for the woman at the center of it, terrifying. If the title of this film startled you, the terrifying wedding night ritual Rome tried to wipe from history, that shock is not rhetorical exaggeration. In many elite Roman households, certain wedding night practices combine devotional spectacle, legal verification, and medical inspection in a way that turned an intimate evening into an institutional procedure. The ritual involved people and objects, among them a veiled wooden phallus known to ancient sources as mutinus tutinus, a name invoking a barely veiled fertility god, and a set of witnesses and specialists whose job was to determine whether the marriage would stand as a legal and social foundation for legitimate heirs. The sources that survive refer to this ceremony in embarrassed phrases or denunciatory sermons. Later Christian writers excoriated it, and in doing so, contributed to its disappearance from common memory. Our reconstruction is necessarily cautious. Where texts are silent, scholars infer. Where they are explicit, they often do so only in elusive or hostile tones. But the pattern that emerges is clear enough to deserve attention, and more importantly, to demand empathy for the women whose bodies and futures were put on trial. If this topic speaks to the part of you drawn to dark corners of cultural history, please like and subscribe. There's more on hidden rituals and recovered voices in the description below. Now, stay with me. We must first situate ourselves among the torches and the songs. The processional, public pageant, private purpose. The wedding procession in Rome was public theater. It announced a legal transaction. The bride, Livia Tersa, let us call her, was escorted from her father's house in a triumph of color and noise. Her saffron-tinged tunic and the veil over her head signaled a transition. Women of the neighborhood accompanied her, singing the old refrains that celebrated union and fertility. Young men beaten drums, improvised jokes. The atmosphere was designed to mark, to bind, to witness. But like many Roman public rites, the spectacle had two sides.
On the surface, it was celebratory. Neighbors exchanged food, musicians played, and the open street became a communal stage. Beneath the drums and the laughter lay purposes more administrative than devotional. Marriage in Roman elite circles was not merely a personal bond between two adults. It was a transfer of legal authority and property rights. The ceremony announced that a paterfamilias had negotiated an alliance, an exchange that affected lineage, inheritance, and the future of households. The songs and ribald jokes, the gestures aimed at fertility, also served to, in a sense, visualize the contract being enacted. In many cases, the public procession ended at a threshold where the private ritual began. The crowd's laughter could thin into a hush as the household's inner members, slaves, elder relatives, the pronuba, took over the procedure. Pronuba is a Latin word for the matron who formally supervised the joining. She acted on behalf of domestic order, ensuring ceremonial correctness. Where wealth, land, or social status hinged on unambiguous legitimate descent, the legal stakes of that night could not be left to rumor or private testimony alone. Entering the house, a god under cloth. Livia walks into the atrium. The air is heavy with incense or the scent of oil. The light is dim. The hearth has been tended. The household is gathered not solely to celebrate, but to observe. In one corner, under a cloth, rests an object that seems grotesquely ordinary and yet charged with meaning. A wooden representation, phallic in form, wrapped and hidden. Ancient sources refer to phallic figures associated with fertility and protection. The name that recurs in late authors is mutinus tutinus, a god whose invocation carries mockery in some texts and ritual necessity in others. The figure is purposely veiled. Ritual concealment amplifies power. There is a ceremonial artistry to the act of unveiling, a controlled exposure that, in the context of a wedding night, functions much like an official inspection. A pronoba stands near the bed, flanked by a physician or midwife and a handful of trusted witnesses, slaves, perhaps a freedman scribe, and male relatives who will sign the necessary attestation. In some households, a centerpiece of the ritual may have been the act of leading the bride to sit upon or over a symbolic object, a gesture interpreted by various writers as a way of enacting union with the household's fertility powers. Sources are coy about exactly how the wooden figure was used. Here we must be explicit about method. Historians reconstruct these gestures from fragmentary references and later legal practice, but the specifics vary and no single household can be said to have followed one rigid script. At a certain moment, the cloth is removed. The reveal is emphatic. The household watches as a god if you accept the gesture as religious, or as an emblem of fertility and male potency if you treat it as symbolic, is unveiled.
The ritual has moved from theater into adjudication. The bride is not only newly married, she is now subject to verification. Manus, property, and the need for proof. To understand why this evening would be conducted like a quasi-legal trial, we must step back and name a key Roman legal concept, manus. Manus is the term for the legal control that a husband or his paterfamilias exercised over his wife following marriage. In the earliest Roman law, marriage frequently meant that a woman passed from the authority of her father into the authority of her husband or his household. That transfer did not merely speak to domestic arrangements, it shaped inheritance, lineage, and the rights of future children to be acknowledged as legitimate heirs. If a marriage was to secure property and succession, doubt about a bride's previous sexual status or uncertainty about immediate consummation could have enormous consequences. An illegitimate child, or a child whose paternity could be contested, might break lineal continuity and redistribute wealth in ways that endangered a family's strategic plans. For elite families, therefore, marriage had to be validated. The validation occurred in public and in procedures that were witnesses to the fact of union and, crucially, to the woman's physical capacity to produce legitimate offspring. Legal texts and anecdotal evidence suggest that household rituals, testimonies, and occasional medical observations were used to create a record. Witnesses were sworn, a bed could be kept in the view of others, a midwife could attest to the physical signs of consummation and virginity. Let me be clear, the precise details vary across time and space. By the late Republic and into the Empire, marriages also existed in forms such as sine manu marriages, where the wife remained legally under her father's authority rather than passing into her husband's manus. But in cases involving property, inheritance, and patrician families, the risk of disputed heirs meant that procedures of verification could and did become formalized. When the parties' stakes were high, so were the mechanisms to forestall later contention. Reconstructing the sequence. Procedure, not pornography. We now enter the delicate part of this reconstruction. Ancient writers, some hostile, some bemused, mention elements of these rituals, but they never offer a uniformly detailed manual. Where we outline a sequence, we do so as a cautious reconstruction built from legal practice, testimonial references, and medical treatises. We avoid salacious description because the point is institutional logic, not titillation. The sequence scholars often propose runs in simplified terms as follows, again with interpretive caution. After the procession and the formal pronuba-led ceremony, the bride and groom approach the domestic bed. The household prepares for what will be, in effect, a supervised consummation.
A wooden phallic figure, mutinus tutinus, may be displayed or invoked as part of the symbolic apparatus that ties personal union to communal fertility. A midwife or physician, present to provide immediate medical confirmation, stands by. Witnesses, slaves, relatives, household clients, observe certain signs that would make the marriage legally incontestable. Those signs could include the presence of a hymen tear or other physical indications of consummation, or the arrival of blood that, in the cultural assumptions of the day, signified virginity given up in the conjugal act. In some accounts, if the bride's status was in question, or if there was the slightest suspicion that the union had not been consummated, the agreement would be provisional. The bed might remain in view, testimony might be taken and sworn. If consummation could not be immediately verified, more invasive inquiry could follow in the days after.
a midwife's exam, a formal deposition, or a household arbitration. We must emphasize again, these practices were not uniform across Roman society. Many marriages were private, uncontroversial, and free from such scrutiny. But in cases of wealth and inheritance, families had incentive to observe and to document what today would be considered a deeply intimate act. Ancient voices, embarrassed mentions, and moralist denunciations. When historians scan Roman literature for descriptions of this wedding night procedure, they encounter two recurring features: oblique reference and moral horror. Varro, a Republican scholar of the 1st century BCE, cataloged many of Roman religious customs, and according to later compilers, treated some of these rites as traditional but awkward to report in polite prose. His work, often cited by later antiquarians, suggests that certain phallic rites were integrated into domestic observances, but Varro and his contemporaries are seldom explicit about the details, partly because it seems these were not subjects for straightforward description in a public forum. Later Christian writers, Augustine in the late 4th and early 5th century CE, Arnobius and Lactantius a few generations earlier, took a different tack. Augustine rails against what he calls pagan obscenities in his polemical works, associating certain fertility cults with moral depravity. Arnobius in his Adversus Natias, early 4th C, and Lactantius, writing in the early 4th century, describe Roman customs with a mix of moral outrage and rhetorical flourish. Their denunciations are crucial to our understanding for two connected reasons. First, they acknowledge that such practices existed and that they were known in the cultural memory. Second, and more consequentially, their denunciatory texts help delegitimate and later to erase these rites from respectable practice as Christianity spread and became institutionalized. This is not to say that Christian criticism alone explains the disappearance of these rituals.
Roman social and legal life was evolving already. Marriage forms shifted, the importance of manus diminished among certain classes, and legal formalities adapted. Yet Christian condemnation supplied moral energy to the process of suppression. A religious movement that sought to reframe marriage as a sacrament or spiritual union had incentive to distance itself from rites that eroticized the divine or treated women as objects of public inspection. Thus, the same writings that preserve our only substantial references to these practices are also the instruments that helped bury them. Medical authors and legal records, sparse but telling. Medical treatises and legal cases offer additional evidence, though again with notable gaps. Physicians and midwives, represented in figures like Soranus of Ephesus, a 2nd century CE physician who wrote on gynecology and midwifery, include clinical descriptions of childbirth, anatomy, and the signs by which virginity or recent sexual activity might be recognized. Their texts are not manualized maps of wedding night rituals, but they supply the vocabulary and observational benchmarks that household examiners would have used. Where legal texts survive, statutes, juristic opinions, or later compilations, there is emphasis on proof, testimony, and the conditions under which a marriage could be challenged. Roman law prized written contracts and verifiable testimony. Where private domestic events had public legal consequences, families sought forms of authentication. A useful comparison is agricultural and property practice. Romans surveyed land, kept titles, and recorded transactions. The logic that required precise recording for a land sale is the same logic that, in some families, produced controlled verification for marital consummation. That parallel should not be read as an analogy intended to demean. Rather, it illuminates the legal reasoning behind what appears, from our vantage, as troubling intrusion. If heirs and property were at stake, the family pursued certainty, and certainty in Rome meant witnesses, sworn testimony, and when available, a medical eye. The missing voices, women absent, and the cost of silence. The historical record is a record of what could be said, who could speak, and who had authority. In the surviving texts, the voice of Livia, the bride, the person most directly affected, is striking in its absence. We can find anecdotes about male relatives, rhetorical condemnations by Christian polemicists, and passing allusions in legal discourse. We do not find, for the most part, the bride's own narrative of fear, humiliation, or resistance. This absence matters. It is not merely an archival frustration. It is an expression of the very power relations that the rituals enacted. The wedding ceremony we have described required the bride's body to be a site of verification, precisely because it was already understood within Roman law and custom as a vehicle for property transmission and lineage. The lack of female testimony means we must be cautious in our reconstructions, but it does not absolve us from imagining the emotional consequences for those women. Scholars draw on parallel sources, private letters, occasional trial records, and later legal petitions to infer how women navigated such intrusions. Some sought redress in court if they felt aggrieved, or if their marital status was disputed. Others apparently endured quietly, their inner lives invisible to the historians who recorded the arrangement of men's households. When Livia is later spoken of in estate records, or when her children's legitimacy is contested, she appears as an item whose state must be certified. That reduction, woman as document, is the heart of what makes this ritual terrifying. It is not only the physical exposure, but the legal framing. She must produce signs that can be witnessed, sworn to, and recorded. That process turns intimacy into evidence and autonomy into something adjudicated by men. Variation and qualification. The ritual was not universal. A crucial qualification must be made at this point. Not all Roman marriages and not all regions of the Roman world practiced these rites in the same way, if at all. Social variation was broad. Lower-class couples, rural households, and many urban plebeian families observed more private, less formal unions. Even among elites, the form of marriage varied. Manus-based unions, with the wife passing fully into the husband's legal authority, were, over time, sometimes supplanted by more flexible marital forms. Additionally, social norms shifted across the centuries covered by our sources. What appears in the propaganda of a late antique Christian writer may refer to practices of an earlier era, to isolated communities, or even to exaggerated accounts used to discredit paganism. When we say, therefore, that Rome had a wedding night ritual involving ritualized verification, we are describing a pattern visible in certain strata and contexts, not a universal practice applied to every household across the empire. That necessary nuance complicates the narrative, but does not diminish the moral and legal force of what did occur in many houses where lineage and property were in question. Silence, suppression, and the work of erasure. As Christianity gained social and political ascendancy, the cultural landscape changed. Suppression of what were perceived as obscene or pagan customs was not merely a matter of rhetoric, it was often active. Temples were closed or repurposed, images were destroyed or removed, and customary practices that conflicted with Christian theology were prescribed. The writings of early Christian apologists and theologians, Augustine, Arnobius, Lactantius among them, were not neutral ethnographies. They were polemics, engaged in delegitimating rival religious systems, and in recasting social practices in morally charged categories.
Their descriptions of phallic cults and sexualized rites serve to both document and condemn. This condemning attention had a paradoxical effect. It preserved certain details precisely by calling them out as evidence of pagan moral failure, while simultaneously preparing the ground for their eradication from respectable communal life. In other words, the ritual survived in written denunciation, even as its physical trappings and public forms were dismantled. For historians, this poses both a methodological boon and a challenge. The very sources that confirm the existence of these practices are part of the machinery that took them out of civic circulation. That is one reason why the ritual could be dramatic enough to frighten, and yet become, in later centuries, an obscured or forgotten element of Roman social history. Archaeology and material traces. Hints, not full scripts. Material culture provides tantalizing but incomplete corroboration. Archaeologists find phallic amulets, household shrines, and votive offerings that hint at the integration of fertility symbolism into domestic life. Terracotta or wooden tokens, frescoes, and inscriptions can be read as evidence for a culture comfortable with sexual imagery as protective or apotropaic. But there is a gap between objects and procedures. An amulet does not describe how it was used on a wedding night. The archaeological record supports the idea that fertility iconography was ordinary and acceptable in many contexts, but it cannot deliver a complete script for a ritual whose precise steps were often unwritten and whose details were culturally sensitive. Bridging the gaps requires a hermeneutic balance. We synthesize legal logic, literary testimony, and material evidence, always marking the difference between what a source explicitly reports and what scholars reasonably infer. This is the responsible way to reconstruct practices that had both legal importance and moral ambiguity. The emotional aftermath, Livia and the long tale of a night. Consider Livia after the reveal, after the attestations are signed and the torches gutter low. She becomes part of a household whose legal frames now name her in certain ways. If the ritual succeeded in producing witnesses and documentation, her children will have a clearer claim to inheritance. If not, she might live with the shadow of dispute. Beyond property and legal claims, however, there is a human cost that the sources rarely articulate, the interior reality of a woman who survived a night where her body was inspected for the sake of lineage.
She may have felt humiliation, relief, anger, or ambivalence. She may have sought sympathy from female kin or found no recourse. The documents that mention her, marriage contracts, dowry agreements, later lawsuits, provide no emotional playbook for her experience.
Legal recourse did exist in some circumstances. Roman women, under certain conditions, could engage legal mechanisms to defend honor, to sue if wronged, or to petition for separation in extreme instances. But recourse requires access, resources, and the will to contest a household's official narrative. Many women lacked these means. Thus, the silence in which many lived was not merely a rhetorical absence, it was structural. The broader legacy, what this ritual reveals about Rome. Why should we invest time in recovering a ritual most people today would find repulsive? Because this rite illuminates critical aspects of Roman society, its obsession with proof, its blending of religious symbolism and legal practice, and its ability to normalize procedures that for many involved meant humiliation and loss of autonomy. Rome developed a legal culture skilled in creating verifiable records. The same procedural rigor that made Rome effective at administering empire could also be deployed on the most intimate domains of life. To say this is not merely to condemn a past culture in modern moral terms, it is to recognize the dual character of legal sophistication. Institutions can generate order and justice, and at the same time assert control in ways that dehumanize. The wedding night ritual, where household witnesses, medical observation, and symbolic objects converged, is one of those uncomfortable places where law and ritual intersect, where the language of proof collides with the vulnerability of individual bodies. Historiography. How scholars read the silence. Modern scholarship has approached these practices with caution and empathy. Historians of law and social historians parse juristic texts in household documents. Anthropologists apply theories of ritual verification and symbolic exchange. Gender historians foreground the absent voices and examine the material conditions of women's lives. Consensus emerges on a few points. Rituals of verification did exist in certain elite contexts. They functioned to protect property and ensure legitimate succession, and the sources that document them are often hostile or evasive. Debate continues on specifics. How widespread were these practices? To what degree did medical knowledge inform household verification? How much did Christian suppression accelerate the disappearance of public rites involving phallic symbolism? Scholars offer competing answers, but they converge on a basic claim. These ceremonies cannot be dismissed as mere superstitions, nor can they be reduced to single motives. They were complex instruments that combined religion, law, and social stratification. Erasure in the making of memory. The ritual's disappearance from common memory is itself revealing. Erasure is rarely accidental. As Christian morality redefined acceptable devotional practice, and as new legal forms gained precedence, rituals associated with older cosmologies lost their public legitimacy. The very process of erasure shaped what later generations could know. The end result is a kind of dual testimony. The practices were visible enough to be denounced and reproved, and then they were systematically suppressed so that the physical evidence was diminished. For historians, that pattern demands humility. The absence of abundant documentation is not proof that something did not exist. It may be evidence of the success of suppression. At the same time, erasure can be traced. In the late antique period, Christian leaders sought to replace old rites with new ones, to redefine marriage as a spiritual union, and to transform the public expression of domesticity. As ritual forms changed, languages of propriety developed that made explicit discussion of sexualized religious symbols less acceptable in polite discourse. The combined effect, a theological reframing, legal evolution, and cultural censorship, accounts for why this ritual, frightening in its logic, faded from collective memory even as it shaped generations of households. Concluding reflection: complexity, condemnation, and memory. So why call it terrifying? Because the ritual we have reconstructed, however partial and subject to scholarly qualification, rendered a woman's intimate life into a matter for public verification, a field for legal certainty. It transformed a personal night into a register for property claims and lineage verification. It was terrifying in effect, even when not intentionally cruel. The system valued proof over privacy, and in that prioritization, it violated the bodily autonomy of women like our hypothetical Livia. And why say Rome tried to wipe it from history? Because the most explicit written references to this ritual come from polemicists who objected to Rome's religious promiscuity precisely by cataloging its supposed excesses. Their texts helped delegitimate the practices, and over generations contributed to the ritual's diminution. That dual movement, exposure through denunciation and subsequent erasure, explains the paradox that we can read about a rite in moralizing literature, even as the rite itself disappears from later civic practice. But there is one final moral that this story presses upon us. Rituals can be instruments of both cohesion and control. They tie communities together, but they also provide the scaffolding through which institutions exercise power over individual bodies. Our task, as historians and as citizens of a later age, is not only to recover the procedural facts, but to recognize the human costs that the records conceal. If this reconstruction felt heavy, that's because it concerns an ordinary legal logic weaponized in intimate contexts. If you want to read more, check the description below for sources and further reading, where primary authors and modern scholars are listed. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and how this history landed with you. Your reactions help shape what we investigate next.
Remember, memory is not only about what is kept, it is also about what has been made to vanish. To study that disappearance is to study power itself.